Jim Cramer was distressed, dismayed, and frightened on a recent day over at CNBC studios. The source of his panic? A new militancy among auto workers led by new UAW President Shawn Fain, who are pushing hard for a better contract and threatening a strike. Take a listen.
I want you to compare the labor negotiations here to the ones in auto, where I think there's going to be a strike, and I think it's going to be horrible.
You're making that call
September
today?
14th, I think they're going to strike. Shawn Fain, the guy who runs the UAW, I find him frightening.
And Teamsters, UPS didn't give you any solace.
Teamsters turned out to be get a good deal. Teamsters historically very powerful union, rich union, but the UAW leader won. There was a very contested vote between the company, the union that wants to work with the autos together to try to preserve some jobs and give the elder people a good pay, and then this man, Shawn, who is just talking about capitalism and the nature of capitalism and how it's really hurt workers. This is very Walter Reuther language. It's the kind of language that when we had in this country, we'll take you down if you don't play ball. That's the language I'm hearing from UAW. Yep. And look, I mean, it's the kind of language where you just say, you know what, we should have built all our EVs in Mexico. It's that bad. I don't think people are paying enough attention. The man is, I'm not saying he's irrational. I'm saying he was elected in order to make it so that there's a very short week to find benefit back. And then the notion that we're fat cats. The shareholders are fat cats and have been overly rewarded. We haven't seen this. He's class warfare. And it's very shocking to hear class warfare.
I honestly got to start watching CNBC more because that was some fantastic content. So Cramer there, he said, it's class warfare, and it's very shocking to hear class warfare. So let's talk a little bit about this class warfare, shall we? Now, back in 2008 and 2009, to set the stage here, when the big three were on the verge of collapse, the Obama administration decided to bail out the industry in order to protect jobs and American manufacturing capacity. And honestly, it was the right call. But it wasn't only the government that stepped up to save the automakers. It was workers at those automakers who offered their own bailout. They put on the chopping block wages, pensions, and healthcare benefits. Now, the rhetoric at the time from the executives, of course, was, oh, we're all in this together. But when profits returned, the gains all flowed to the top. Today, starting wages at the big three are about $10 lower per hour than they were back in 2007 when you account for inflation. In the bailout, workers gave up annual cost of living increases, something that the UAW first won back in the 1940s. And without those gains to keep up with inflation, worker wages for both new and experienced workers fell further and further behind. Not so for the CEOs of the automakers, though. They have seen their pay spike 40% in just the past several years, widening a massive gulf between the pay of the executives and those of the workers, whose labor, of course, makes the whole thing go. In fact, at a time when the typical GM employee's wages went down, CEO Mary Barra got a huge raise, saw her overall compensation jump up to $29 million per year. This was class war, all right, the kind that has been standard fare in America since the 80s, the kind that Jim Cramer is very comfy with, where the working class always loses. Now, take a listen to how UAW president that Cramer referenced there, Shawn Fain, take a listen to how he described the class warfare that has been waged against his members at a time when the automakers are back to record-breaking profitability.
So what have the big three done with these staggering profits? Instead of rewarding the workers who spent long hours wrecking their bodies on the line to make these profits possible, the big three have funneled billions into stock buyback schemes that artificially inflate the value of company shares and further enrich company executives in the top 1%. That's billions of dollars that have been robbed from the workers who made these profits possible. That's billions of dollars that weren't spent on the EV transition. So when the big three say the future's uncertain and that the EV transition's expensive, remember that they've made $250 billion in North American profits over the last decade and have poured billions of it into special dividends, stock buybacks, and supersized executive compensation. Our message going into bargaining is clear. Record profits mean record contracts.
But it is not just lagging wages, multi-tier compensation, and degraded benefits that has UAW members up in arms. They see this current contract negotiation as existential because of something that Shawn Fain referenced there, the EV transition. Now, the union does not oppose the transition to electric vehicles. They just oppose using that transition as an excuse to screw workers, which of course is exactly what the automakers are doing, with, I might add, an assist from the Biden administration. Many of the new EV battery plants are joint partnerships with foreign companies that are not subject to UAW contracts. These new plants are also concentrated in southern states in environments that are more hostile to unionization. And already the union has plenty of examples to point to where lower-paid EV jobs are replacing higher-paid gas-powered vehicle jobs. Lordstown, Ohio is a perfect example here. GM closed their storied plants in the town only to reopen an EV battery joint venture where workers make half of what the old labor force was earning. And UAW isn't just waging war with the automakers over this state of affairs, but also with the Biden administration. After all, no surprise that giant corporate multinationals would do everything they can to cheat labor. But Biden, hey, he's supposed to be the most pro-union president ever. And yet his EV incentives did not include necessary requirements that the jobs created be union or even match the pay and benefit rates of existing auto manufacturing jobs. In fact, bucking the trend of many other unions which have fallen in line behind Biden's reelect, Fain and the UAW pointedly refused to endorse the president. They instead issued a scathing rebuke of the no-strings-attached dollars, slamming them for, quote, funding a race to the bottom and facilitating corporate greed. Everything is really at stake for workers in the auto industry right now, and there are huge implications overall for the dying American middle class. These workers join the ranks of hundreds of thousands of others who are using this time of fat profits and tight labor markets to try to strike a better deal and claw back some portion of what workers have lost out to capital over the past 40 years. And I have to tell you, pretty impressed with the audacity of the auto workers' asks. They are pushing for a 20% pay hike now, with additional 5% increases until the pay increase reaches 40%, number which, by the way, consistent with the pay hikes that the big three CEOs have garnered over just the past several years. They are also asking for a right to strike over plant closures and for automakers to fund a program that would keep workers employed if those automakers decide to close a plant. They're demanding that EV workers get the same deal as non-EV workers. And they're making some real demands for work-life balance, including shorter work weeks and more paid time off. Contrast that with the posture of the labor movement since the 90s, where they were constantly on the back foot, constantly playing defense, trying to keep the concessions from cutting too deep. Now we got new leadership at the Teamsters, which just won quite a bit for their members and a tentative deal that their members are now voting on. 323,000 workers across the country have already gone out on strike this year, making it one of the biggest years for strikes since the year 2000. Among those workers, of course, are the writers and actors who are fighting their own existential battle to have a stake in the future of that industry. And this all comes at a time when public support for unions has skyrocketed across party lines, forming a new national consensus, bipartisan consensus in favor of workers against capital. It is truly a new day. So yeah, I guess maybe Jim Cramer is right to be a little trembling over the class war, because for the first time in my life, his side of the class war could actually lose. And this is the next big fight. September is the deadline for these contract negotiations. It is a very similar scenario to with the Teamsters. Shawn Fain was elected because, number one, they wanted to get rid of the old leadership that was sort of too cozy with the boss class, but also he directly ran on a promise to be more aggressive and more militant in these negotiations. And they have put out a very audacious set of demands here.
I mean, if you look at the Shawn Fain comments and put it up against like the writers, people are intentionally, I think, looking at this as an existential time to secure the future.
That's
and
right.
I think that is the correct decision. I mean, if you have leverage, now is the time to use it, because it's possible that they may be literally discarded, 4 to 5 years from now. There's a counter argument to that you often hear, which is that will just mean the acceleration of technology, like, that will replace the overall workforce. But, in general, we have not really seen, or what we have seen is that companies are going to do that anyway. So while you have it and while you can fight for it, I do think it's important. And it's a legitimate philosophical question. It's like with your cars, I mean, what do you want to go into that car? What should we pay for a car? And how should it all look? That's why it really bothered me. The Cramer, talk and all of that, because that's exactly what led to the destruction of the great American car companies, to the overall industrial middle class that has been completely gone. And if we are to, actually step away from our problems right now, we really have to recreate some of the social cohesion that we had from the 50s and the 60s that took a lot of the progressive era in the 1920s to accomplish.
I mean, one of the most kind of iconic parts that helped build the American middle class is the automaking industry.
Yeah.
I mean, auto workers, this has been for generations seen as like solid middle class job. And so the core question here is, okay, as we make the transition to EVs, which is happening, in full effect right now, are we going to maintain these auto jobs as a bedrock part of the middle class? And that has huge implications, not just for auto workers, just like the Teamsters potential strike had huge implications, not just for UPS workers. But these jobs help set the standard for wages across a variety of industries. So it is wild to see the trend. Listen, we still have to be honest. Union density has continued to decline, even in an era where you have a lot more activity, you have a lot more agitation, a lot more militancy among some of the leadership. But it really does feel like we've turned a corner when you have, I mentioned a bipartisan consensus there. Let's be clear, the bipartisan consensus is among the people, not among the leadership, where there's often a bipartisan consensus in the other direction. But the American people have clearly decided that at this point in history, they're much more on the side of labor clawing some back from capital, and that is a good thing to see.
Hey guys, if you want to see what I had to say to Krystal's monologue, not just this one, all of them, going back to the very beginning, become a premium subscriber today, breakingpoints.com.